Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're actually going to continue what we were doing yesterday. So let's look into what we did yesterday. We pretty much went into إِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ لِأَبِيهِ آزَرَ أَتَتَّخِذُ أَصْنَامًا. But then we actually discussed a couple things while we were working on those ayat. Yeah, we gave a general translation for the ayat. And then we gave a couple, let's call it preludes right there to discuss one, Israeliyat, and how the Muslims had used the Israeliyat. Sometimes I would say abused, using it as, or using the Israeliyat as resources. And we went in details in regards to Israeliyat. We also went in details trying to see in the methodology of tafsir and how we would actually use the methodology of tafsir in order to have, let's say, a proper mindset that is capable of scrutinizing the world around us based on Quran and Sunnah, and not necessarily based on other influences, whether it's a personal influence, cultural influence, or perhaps other influences that might be out there. So we talked about that piece of it, and we were, I would say, sucked in with that whole methodology, because the word azar. So if when Ibrahim had told his father, and the word says azar, then we went into all those tafasir to, I guess, let's say, figure out, is Azar the name of Prophet Ibrahim? Is Azar a description or a name for the idol? Or is Azar a description derived therefore from the word that it basically means that he is wrong or erroneous or sinful for what he had chosen? And we talked about how each and every single one of those interpretations basically uses a certain one. So whether we're talking about the semantic, whether we're talking about the grammar, whether we're speaking about the structure in Lugha Arabiya, and how the scholars that use this or that interpretation, or the hermeneutics and how that falls, how each and every single one basically either depended on the Lugha Arabiya or the structure, or probably depended on it's again the semantics of it. So we talked about this piece. And certainly there are two other qira'at, and we also talked about this piece of it. And with these two other qira'at, let's just see right there, hold on, we said izran and azran or izran, and we said these two qira'at would basically make it that it is more giving us the inference that Isra is more, or Azar is more of the name of an idol that his father, that is Ibrahim's father, used to worship. We also talked about a story about Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam that we would find in Muslim literature that that kind of sounds similar to Prophet Ibrahim's story, that the Namrud was attempting to kill every single born male child in order to make sure that that no one would take over his kingdom and so forth. So then his mother, I guess, managed to, or his father and mother managed to basically have Ibrahim alayhi salam. Anyhow, the story, of course, like you heard it last time, and we talked about that resource and how we don't actually have a legitimate valid resource from an Islamic resource. And yes, it could be written in Islamic literature, but that does not necessarily make it, as just because it's written there, that it is necessarily valid. So we went in some details that. Okay, so this is where we left off at. وكذلك نري إبراهيم ملكوت السماوات والأرض وليكون من الموقنين. Okay, so when you look at the word كذلك, what is كذلك? كذلك is telling me that there's a certain pattern. Okay, what is that pattern? Well, the pattern is that there is something that preceded a certain mission. Okay, so at least within this context, so that there is a certain mission, a certain pattern that preceded the mission when Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam had told his father Azar not to take the idols as gods. Okay, now when it says وَكَذَلِكَ نُرِي إِبْرَاهِيم, here's the thing. Remember in the Quran, just like you would have in stories, there would be kind of like a trailer, and sometimes the trailers bring the story from the very end. Okay, let's say, like for example, Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam's story in the Quran. It starts out with the story really from the end, but yes, certainly it starts out with this child having a dream that he had seen Shams wal Qamar and the Nujum, all of them, they're prostrating to him. This child is basically, that's how the story starts. But the story is, telling us from that starting point, but that's not how the story necessarily, that's not how the story begins. Okay, but the Quran chooses to start from that in order to give us the curiosity of how this dream will fold at the end. Okay, how it will unfold at the end. And of course, we know that in Surah Yusuf alayhi salam, that the story unfolds, or the story concludes and ends with basically his father, his stepmother, his brothers basically prostrating for him, and he was basically sitting on the throne, and then he said that this is تأويل رؤياي من قبل قد جعلها ربي حقا. This is the interpretation of the dream that I had, basically telling his father, remember this, I had this dream right there, and here it is, it's happening. So you could see that it is common, and it's not just that. Same thing with the story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Sometimes it would actually tell us, like a trailer in the beginning, and then it would tell us how things would unfold. So is this similar to that? That it would tell us Ibrahim alayhi salam was telling his father that, and inni araka wa qawmaka fi dhal mubin, I see you and your people in obvious delusion, in a very obvious delusion, and therefore Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was this. So the first opinion that regarded that this isn't the story of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam's journey, but this is the story of Prophet Ibrahim's journey to da'wah. Journey to da'wah, not journey to certainty. Okay, so therefore, the scholars that said that this was his story to da'wah, it basically said, well, this tells us that he was doing it with his father, but here's the story of how he had done it to his father, and it starts out with كَذَلِكَ نُرِي إِبْرَاهِيم. How did Ibrahim alayhi salam get to the point to recognize that his father was actually in a complete delusion, was actually doing the wrong thing, etc. Well, this ayah basically tells us وَكَذَلِكَ نُرِي إِبْرَاهِيم. So this is the paradigm. This is how it started out. Ibrahim alayhi salam was basically given the vision. What vision? When you look at nuri, the word nuri means vision. But is this vision basically coming as a ru'ya sadiqa, or is this vision meaning il-wahi? Okay, so whether it was a ru'ya sadiqa or il-wahi, it basically did inspire yaqeen. That's all that is important, and that's why it said وَلِيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ. Whether it was what is الرؤية الصادقة? الرؤية الصادقة are basically dreams that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspires the prophets or salihin, or even the pious people with. And this dream basically would speak to them, inspire them, whether of truth or whether of future or whether of good things or wisdom, etc. All of that is basically that ru'ya sadiqa. It could be telling them of something that's going to happen in the future. It could be, or something in the past. Or in other words, it's not as a result of, let's say, shaitan, or a result of, I guess, physical things happening, sleeping on a stone and thinking that someone was stabbing them or something like that, even though it was just a small pebble. Okay, or probably had just a big meal and they started getting all those nightmares because they basically just didn't eat right, or it was too heavy, or whatever it is, and their brain basically is processing it, or at least what's happening in their guts. Their brain is processing it as a battle right there somehow. Okay, and therefore that would be as a result of either shaitan, or a result of different physical changes basically happening. Okay, but الرؤيا الصادقة is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It could be telling them of the past or the future, or giving them a wisdom, or giving them some information. That's a الرؤيا الصادقة. الوحي, on the other hand, الوحي would basically be when Jibril alayhi salam would come to them physically. So come to them physically, whether talking to them when they cannot see him, or that he would talk to them, that is the prophets, when they cannot necessarily see Prophet Ibrahim, or he can come in a human shape and he would talk to them physically in a human shape, just like Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He basically had, and even the Sahaba, they had seen, remember that hadith in al-40 النووية, بينما نحن جلوس عند رسول الله إذ طلع علينا رجل شديد بياض الثياب شديد سواد الشعر لا يرى عليه أثر السفر ولا يعرفه منا أحد حتى جلس إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Right, so the rest of the hadith, or حتى جلس إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فأسند ركبتيه إلى ركبتيه, etc. All right. Now, when you look at that, of course, the Sahaba didn't know who he was, and they said, لا يعرفه منا أحد, لا يرى عليه أثر السفر ولا يعرفه منا أحد. So we know that there wasn't something that was indicating that he was on a journey, or that he was someone familiar to anybody, but something rather odd is what they were basically expressing. Something rather odd, expressing an affirmation to a certain question that he's asking, and basically becoming the teacher at that moment, as in that hadith. There is also another method that the information, not necessarily seeing Jibril alayhi salam, because he did see Jibril alayhi salam, just like when he had seen him during the time when he was in Ghar Hira. He attempted to run out of the cave, but his wings were stretching out so massive that it was completely covering the east and the west. That's how big Jibril alayhi salam was appearing to him. So that is another way. Another third way is Sayyidah Aisha had mentioned that she had thought that was Dihya al-Kalbi, when later the Prophet ﷺ would tell her that wasn't actually Dihya, that was actually Jibril alayhi salam himself. So come in a human shape, and or the other method is that Jibril alayhi salam would come and reveal the ayat, and the Prophet ﷺ would see it or would hear it, but the Sahaba next to him would hear a buzzing sound. So they would only hear a buzzing sound, but not really understand where this buzzing sound is coming from. But they would know that it's Jibril alayhi salam, because every time they would hear this buzzing sound, they would then know that the Prophet ﷺ basically got a revelation. So that is il-wahy. something that he could see, something that he can talk to, something that he can sometimes communicate with, etc. That would be Jibreel alayhi salam. That would be wahi. But nuri can actually mean two types. Can mean an actual wahi, and can also mean الرؤيا الصادقة, which is basically that dream. At the end, like we said, regardless of the method, the Prophet ﷺ, or Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ, basically reached that level of certainty, and then certainly he was capable of seeing malakut as-samawati wal-ard. So here's the thing. What is malakut? Il-malakut itself basically means one, it means kingdom, and il-malakut could also mean that you're speaking about how expansive something is, how big something is, how vast something is, how deep something is. So that would be il-malakut. So what does that actually mean? So when we're speaking about nuri, that he was capable of seeing, it was an enlightenment, and of course he was capable of seeing what is in the heavens. Was that meaning malakut as-samawati wal-ard, what something that is deeper than the surface of what we would see in the skies? Does that mean he was capable of seeing the angels and probably the different things in the skies, or probably know certain stories about Adam alayhi salam, were the children of Adam? In other words, basically know certain wahi that let Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam know what is beyond this creation. Okay, so if we were to say malakut as-samawati wal-ard, is this talking about the actual space within this universe, or is this talking about the depth behind the creation of the heavens and the earth? Ustaz Umayya, go ahead, dear.
Yeah, Bismillah. Can we consider that al-Kawkab and the Qamar and Shams is part of the Malakut al-Samawat?
Right, it is definitely. There's no doubt that it's part of al-Malakut as-Samawati wal-Ard. But why didn't it just say كذلك نوري إبراهيم السماوات والأرض? Because that would be inclusive to the sky, basically with the moon and the stars and all of that. But when you say malakut, no, there is an intended meaning that there is either something that is deep or something that is basically in what it contains. So are we talking about what this universe contains, whether information, what this universe contains, whether information, or whether we're speaking about the malaika themselves and all those things that you cannot see by looking at the skies, but it's actually beyond the surface. So that's why the scholars actually had differences of opinions on what did he actually see, what really is il-malakut that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was given. Why using that word? So that's the first opinion. The first opinion, they basically said that il-malakut is referring to beyond the surface, meaning that he was capable of seeing malaika, he was capable of seeing the story behind creation. In other words, we're talking about the Genesis, we're talking about the purpose of life, and we're speaking about all that wahi that basically is letting us know that there is something magnificent behind the creation of the heavens and the skies that you are seeing right there. So Prophet Ibrahim, in other words, was given deeper knowledge, a vision that is deeper than what you and I might have using our intelligence, using probably the best of science or whatever it is, but it is basically to go beyond, to recognize the purpose of life, to recognize basically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator, to recognize that this life is not just a materialistic ball or a materialistic thing that is out there, but that there's actually a magnificent reason, a magnificent purpose that basically had preceded the creation of this universe. Okay, so
Quran didn't mention specifically what exactly Ibrahim alayhi salam saw or of this malakut.
What was that? Say it again.
And the Quran didn't mention anything about this malakut, explain anything to us about malakut, that he saw it.
So there are some scholars, we're going to get there. Some scholars did actually say, well, malakut as-samawati wal-ard is basically related to this. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Lord that خلق السماوات والأرض بالحق ويوم يقول كن فيكون قوله الحق, that is al-malakut that it's referring to. That's one opinion. They said, well, why go far when right there, malakut as-samawati wal-ard, just like he's informing you that he's the one that created the heavens and the earth in truth, and that one day the Lord Almighty will basically order to blow in the horn, and that's basically when everyone would come and resurrect to the Lord Almighty. So some scholars actually said malakut as-samawati wal-ard, that you as well, just by knowing this piece of information, that he is the Lord that created the heavens and the earth and all of that is in itself malakut as-samawati wal-ard. That's that same piece of knowledge that all of this ayah right there and the details of it is basically as malakut as-samawati wal-ard. So you had this knowledge. This is the vision that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala summarized it as, this is malakut as-samawati wal-ard. Malakut as-samawati wal-ard is that you recognize the vastness, but you also recognize the purpose that preceded the existence, and you recognize also that there is Judgment Day, and you recognize basically the foundation and the ending, and you recognize what's behind this creation, so that this is malakut as-samawati wal-ard, and that this piece of knowledge is what will get that person to certainty, what gets Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam to certainty. So that was another, and I absolutely love this interpretation, to be honest, because of one, the ayah right here already telling us about as-samawati wal-ard bil-haq, in the whole idea that this is the truth, what's behind this creation, etc. And that here it is when it tells us alimul ghaybi wa shahada, he's basically the one to have all the knowledge in al-ghayb, and that's basically, when you look at the word in Lugha Arabiya al-malakut, you were seeing that the scholars were actually talking about the hidden things within the skies. Well, that's al-ghayb wa shahada. All right. When you say al-hakim, al-khabir, to take that moment to acknowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything for the purpose of his own ilm, that he determined and he had created it for a wisdom. And therefore, we would reach that moment and recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ilm is beyond. So we would submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom. We would submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ilm. And that's what would get us to yaqeen. So I personally feel that this Nuri Ibrahim malakut samawati wal ard, that it's related to the previous ayah. But let's see what the other scholars are saying. This one, this one's quite interesting. It was said, I'll just quote what he said. It was said that it was referring to what is in the heavens, and what is in the heavens from the angels basically worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and all the different strange things. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had revealed to him that, O Ibrahim, min asma'i sabur, amsik an ibadi. So there are certain things at the end that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically be that he's a sabur, that he will basically be patient and give them the amount of time in order to seek repentance in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, now here's the thing. This hadith is actually not authentic. Okay, this hadith is not authentic, but yeah, I could imagine, and I can probably hear maybe, I don't know, Sheikh Kishk using that, Sharawi using that, but at the end, well, it's mentioned in the books of hadith and books of tafsir. Okay, let's see the other opinion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had shown him, that is basically Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, the heavens and the earth and even the throne and even what is underneath the different planets. And basically a narration says on Ibrahim al-Nakhai, فرجت له السماوات السبع فنظر إليهن حتى انتهى إلى العرش وفرجت له الأرضون فنظر إليهن, that it was open basically for Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam to see the seven heavens, and he had seen them, even was capable of seeing the throne itself, and that it was open to him to basically see all the different planets, all the different basically, well, whether we're speaking about Earth and what that means, and he had seen all of that, and he had seen his place in Jannah. Okay, and they said, well, the evidence is وَآتَيْنَاهُ أَجْرَهُ فِي الدُّنْيَا. We had given him his reward in this dunya. And some scholars actually considered that this ayah, which definitely is talking about Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, أَتَيْنَاهُ أَجْرَهُ فِي الدُّنْيَا, he was given his reward in dunya. Does that mean part of the reward to see Jannah, something that no one else basically got, that he had seen Jannah? Did he actually see Jannah in his dream, or did he see Jannah as a miracle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had shown him, similar to al-Isra wal-Mi'raj? Okay, now the thing is that this hadith is also not authentic, but at the end of the day is that the word Nuri Ibrahim malakut as-samawati wal-ard does actually, within context, does give similar meaning, that he was capable of seeing all of that. So it doesn't really go farther than what we had seen right here. So are we then, وَهُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ بِالْحَقِّ? Is this the vision that we're getting to understand, to comprehend? Or is this a vision that he was capable of actually seeing physically, the skies and the earth and it's all of that? Or was it something that he had seen in a dream? Okay, that's the idea. Is it a vision of intelligence, or is it a vision in a dream, or is it a vision in person, just like al-Isra wal-Mi'raj? Okay, let's see. Another scholar said, أراه من ملكوت السماوات ما قصه من الكواكب وملكوت الأرض البحار والجبال والأشجار ونحو ذلك مما استدل به. Okay, another scholar basically said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him the knowledge about it in order to basically have the knowledge to be capable to use that knowledge as a way to debate, and even use that as a way, an ilm, basically to later use it to debate and even argue, to bring truth and enlightenment to the rest of the world. So that's and this is important, because in order to be capable of debating or proving a point or probably teaching Islam, you have to have knowledge not only in the truth, in other words, the message itself, but you also have to have some knowledge in science, possibly physics, math, whatever it is. In other words, you have to have this general knowledge in different areas of knowledge, in different areas of sciences, in order for you to be capable of defending Islam and defending the religion and understanding the religion. So is this that piece of it, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him such knowledge that enabled him to later use that knowledge to and basically use it for da'wah, which is as what we would see in these ayat. Basically use it for da'wah. Let's say we did talk about this story, and you could see that this is very similar. He says that certainly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him the ability to see the planets and the different things on earth, whether we're speaking malakut al-samawat. If we're talking about malakut al-samawat, is different than malakut al-ard, because malakut al-samawat is going to be planets, is going to be the galaxies, the sun, etc., all these different things. But malakut al-ard, everything that the earth contains, whether we're speaking about ocean, sea, mountains, trees, etc., all these different things. Okay, and that later that's what he was using, basically that knowledge that he was learning about this world, that's what he was using in order to debate or even to enlighten and bring the others that are misguided basically to the light of Islam. Okay, let's see. We did talk about the story, so I'm not going to repeat the story. Let's see. So Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, the lesson to learn right there, وَلِيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ, that it was one method. But here's the thing. One method to get to yaqeen is to see malakut as-samawati wal-ard, to get to yaqeen. Are there different ways to get to yaqeen? Let's go to Surah al-Najm for a bit. Let's go to Surah al-Najm. Let's just remember, this is page 146. But I'm going to go to Surah al-Najm for a bit, because it was actually, is this it? No, because in Surah al-Najm, it actually takes us to understanding a number of different things about yaqeen specifically. Let's see. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى وَمَا يَنطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى عَلَّمَهُ شَدِيدُ الْقُوَى ذُو مِرَّةٍ فَاسْتَوَى. Okay, what are we getting here? وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى, by the falling stars. Your friend was not in a delusion and is not speaking of his own self, and he is not speaking of his own desire. It is nothing but wahyun yuha. It is a revelation through Jibreel alayhi salam, who taught him mighty, allamahu shadidul quwa, who basically taught him, and he's a mighty angel. Okay. And then فَأَوْحَى إِلَى عَبْدِهِ مَا أَوْحَى, gave him basically the different wahy. مَا كَذَبَ الْفُؤَادُ مَا رَأَى. Notice that the word used رَأَى. The heart was not in delusion, was not lying about what he had seen. Notice the word used was رَأَى, similar to وَكَذَلِكَ نُرِي. So here we go. Did he actually see the angels, see malakut as-samawati wal-ard? What did he actually see? Okay, and then it goes, مَا زَاغَ الْبَصَرُ وَمَا طَغَى. Again, مَا زَاغَ الْبَصَرُ وَمَا طَغَى, again using that whole idea of al-basar, of sight, and certainly with that sight, basically to tell us that al-ilm is a number of different kinds. There's the ilm al-wahi, and that's why he said right there, مَا كَذَبَ الْفُؤَادُ مَا رَأَى in al-wahi. And then there's also مَا زَاغَ الْبَصَرُ وَمَا طَغَى. That was actually real sight that he was capable of seeing through. لَقَدْ رَأَى. Here's this, another one again. The word رَأَى again. لَقَدْ رَأَى مِنْ آيَاتِ رَبِّهِ الْكُبْرَى. He had seen from the different signs, the magnificent signs from his Lord Almighty. I want you to see how many times it said, there's al-wahi, there's ma ra'a, ma zagha al-basar, ra'a. Notice that it was focusing so much on something basically being visual, something seen, that there's no delusion. It was something that he could see. أفرأيتم اللات والعزى. Now it jumps into, okay, I'm informing you of something. Now it jumps into, let's create this dialogue. Now that you basically got this as an information right there, now I'm directing the speech at you personally. And you, أفرأيتم اللات والعزى, you see that those idols that you worship, Allat and al-Uzza and Manat al-Thalithat al-Ukhra. Now let's discuss what your faith basically entails. ألكم الذكر وله الأنثى. Now, what does it do? Basically starts, okay, let's use right now common sense. Let's use common sense. You regard being female as inferior, so why would you attribute something that you regard as inferior to God? Do you regard God as inferior and therefore you're living in this type of paradox? Are you here degrading your Lord Almighty? Then what is it doing? It's basically telling you to once recognize the vision. Now there's another type of vision, which is the mental vision. And then that's why it basically tells us, what a paradox, what a strange paradigm that you would basically apply onto the Lord Almighty. Now look at this one. Now it takes us in here إلا أسماء سميتموها أنتم وآباؤكم. Again, look at this one. We're going to get somewhere, so be patient, okay? إن هي إلا أسماء سميتموها أنتم وآباؤكم ما أنزل الله بها من سلطان. They're just names that you and your ancestors had named, and nothing that of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given any authority, any evidence, any evidence, we could just leave it at that, proof that this is at all valid. يتبعون إلا الظن. Stop right there. يتبعون إلا الظن وما تهوى الأنفس وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُمْ مِنْ رَبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى. I want to look at this one. They follow speculation and they follow their own whims and desires, and their Lord Almighty had sent them the truth. Now that's to tell us what? So knowledge, and what Surah An-Najm is telling us, that certainty first starts with recognizing, is this a true source? Speaking about the Prophet himself. That's the beginning. That's the beginning. If you cannot recognize the beginning and the foundation of certainty, then you're going to find yourself using different sources of trying to get to certainty. You're either going to end up using your own mind and your own speculation trying to understand the world, or you're going to depend on your own sensations and your own feelings and what you're feeling and how you understand the world around you using sensations, or you're وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُمْ مِنْ رَبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى, and the Lord Almighty had given them the guidance. What is the guidance? That's al-wahy. So in other words, what it was telling us, that in order to get to certainty, to understand the source, and the source to understand truth, you basically have limited options. Certainly you can use your intelligence, you could use your brain, you could use trying to understand the world, but even understanding the world and understanding certain things and how they function is going to be limited to understanding different matter and how it functions, but not necessarily why it functions. Not necessarily why it functions. So therefore, you end up using perhaps the different sensations, the different senses to probably get to some information, to getting to some knowledge about, well, what is behind all of this? What and why was this created? That's what you're going to get to, some senses telling you, okay, this is making me happy, this is not making me happy, this is feeling painful, this is not feeling painful. You're going to get some senses that basically give you an idea that this is taking me to basically a good end or a wrong end, but what is good and what is bad. And then we recognize that even good feelings can sometimes be deceiving. Yes, it feels good, but just because it feels good, it doesn't make it right. Because we would know based on the conclusion later on that it got to, that it wasn't necessarily right. So our sensations are not valid resources that we could necessarily depend on as something that we can consider as a resource that we could depend on to reach certainty. Okay. And even with science / adhan, theory, science, intelligence, research, anecdotal, empirical, all of that is basically going to be within adhan. It's going to be within the area of speculation. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ. And I want you to look at this word وَلَقَدْ, because laqad would basically here be tahqiq if it was basically coming with, basically coming after it, a past tense. So if it was a present tense, يَأْتِهِمْ, that would be tashkik. That would be bringing in what? That would be bringing in doubt. But since it was followed by a verb that is a past tense, then the laqad would be harf tahqiq. It is to announce certainty. Laqad is two kinds, tahqiq and tashkik, or qad is tashkik and tahqiq. If it is followed by a past tense, it would be tahqiq. If it is followed by a future or a present tense, it would be tashkik. Tashkik basically means doubt and skepticism, uncertainty. But if it is followed by a past tense, it is tahqiq. It is to bring affirmation and certainty. And that's basically what this sentence is giving us, that there is certainty, and the only place of certainty that you can depend on as the foundation to help you know the truth is basically وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى, that the Lord Almighty had sent them the guidance. أَمْ لِلْإِنسَانِ مَا تَمَنَّى. What is أَمْ لِلْإِنسَانِ مَا تَمَنَّى? Or is it going to be you creating your own truths based on what you would hope the truth would be? Absolutely not. You don't create truth, but you discover the truth. You don't create it. In the postmodern world, you create your own truth. You create your own purpose. You invent your own purpose. You invent your own identity. In fact, you invent your own gender. You make up your own gender. You make up everything about yourself. But in the Quran, it tells you, no, you don't invent these things. There are certain realities that you just have to acknowledge. Those realities that you acknowledge are basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَلِلَّهِ الْآخِرَةُ وَالْأُولَى, the Lord Almighty is basically the one to control al-akhirah and even al-ula. Why did it say al-akhirah first? Al-akhirah is going to be eternal. It's going to be everlasting. There's no ending. It's khalidina fiha. So that's that area that you need to focus on. Al-ula is basically this life. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that when we speak about what is the truth, we're actually talking about the truth that lies in between al-akhirah and al-ula. That lies between the judgment day and the beginning and the genesis and the foundation of this universe. What is in between? What is the purpose? And therefore, recognizing that we cannot whatsoever depend on our own whims and cannot depend on our own mind to bring about the reason and create a certain reason for this creation, but it has to be Basically, وَمَا لَهُمْ بِهِ مِنْ عِلْمٍ. They have no knowledge. إِن يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. They would just follow their own whims. وَإِنَّ الظَّنَّ لَا يُغْنِي مِنَ الْحَقِّ شَيْئًا. And the dhann basically comes nothing compared to truth. So how should I relate to all of that? Well, you would give your piece of da'wah, but you also have to فَأَعْرض عَمَّنْ تَوَلَّى عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا. But you have to take a stance, basically isolating yourself away from those that would turn away from the remembrance of the Lord Almighty. And when their aim and their goal is just this hayat dunya, and that's all they know, and that's all they care about in this dunya, well, then in that situation, inna rabbaka huwa a'lam biman dhalla an sabila. Your Lord Almighty is the one that judges, but that judgment is not to say, well, I don't want to judge. You have to judge, because if you don't recognize who tawalla an dhikrina, then this ayah would not be something that we can apply. You have to know who tawalla an dhikrina, who went away from the remembrance of the Lord Almighty. In other words, you have to judge. You have to judge, not to necessarily let me go announce it here and there. Sometimes I have to. If this person is becoming public in their fitna, I have to be public in my da'wah and basically tell people that this is a fitna right there. I would have to be public. But if this person is, living in their own fitna and basically in isolation, well, we'll give them a private hidayah. But if they're doing fitna that is public, now right then in that situation, I have to expose the fitna, and sometimes by exposing the person himself or herself, and actually say, here's the fitna, here's the hypocrisy, here's what this contains, here's where this is leading us to. Okay, وَلِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Now here it is. What is it taking us to? لِلَّهِ مَا فِي. For the Lord Almighty belongs basically the heavens and the earth. And again, لِيَجْزِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسَاءُوا بِمَا عَمِلُوا وَيَجْزِيَ الَّذِينَ أَحْسَنُوا بِالْحُسْنَى. Why is that the case? Because the Lord Almighty would be holding people accountable for whatever they had done, for those يَجْزِيَ الَّذِينَ أَحْسَنُوا بِالْحُسْنَى, those that had done well, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give them al-husna, al-jannah. Okay, now when you look at all of that, what is that taking us? Notice here, أعنده علم الغيب فهو يرى أفرأيت الذي تولى وأعطى قليلا وأكدى أعنده علم الغيب فهو يرى. What is that علم الغيب? What is all that information that was giving us right there, telling us what that nuri, just like nuri Ibrahim malakut samawati wal ard, that vision to see truth, to recognize truth, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَّبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى, and to also see it on ground, وَلِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ, and to also recognize the purpose behind this creation, and basically الَّذِينَ يَجْتَنِبُونَ كَبَائِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَالْفَوَاحِشَ إِلَّا اللَّمَمَ إِنَّ رَبَّكَ وَاسِعُ الْمَغْفِرَةِ وَأَعْلَمُ بِكُمْ إِذْ أَنشَأَكُم مِّنَ الْأَرْضِ وَإِذْ أَنتُمْ أَجِنَّةٌ فِي بُطُونِ أُمَّهَاتِكُمْ فَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنِ اتَّقَى. Notice the word ittaqa right there, because the other one, of course, وَلْيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ. Now it's taking us to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam again. You see the correlation between these two surahs? It's taking us to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam to let us know how we understand certainty. Ibrahim alladhi wafa alla tazir waziratu wizra ukhra وأن ليس للإنسان إلا ما سعى وأن سعيه سوف يرى. Here's again. That's it. Whatever they had contributed, whatever they had made, whatever they had committed, it's basically going to be seen. What is that basically taking us into in order to tell us that this key one, فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكَ تَتَمَارَى. That's the key one. فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكَ تَتَمَارَى. I don't want to go in the tafsir of the whole surah, but how do you debate or argue all the different evidences that, one, mental, two, or let's call it intelligence, or two, you recognize basically through al-wahi as وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. You recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically sent you this wahi to let you know and be informed about the reason for this creation, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala وَلِلَّهِ الْآخِرَةُ وَالْأُولَى. That's at the end. أزفت الآزفة ليس لها من دون الله كاشفة. So now we see the correlation between these two surahs, and that at the end, what are we getting to here? وَلِيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ. What's the opposite of yaqeen? It's dhann. The opposite of yaqeen is a dhann. A dhann is speculation. A dhann is speculation. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about Prophet Ibrahim getting to yaqeen, it was him getting to yaqeen, whether through al-wahy or whether it was learning about the world itself and how it basically stands on, yes, this is basically created right there, and that truth is not based on speculation or based on your own senses and what you want the truth to be, but it's actually something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had predetermined before life was even created. So now that's yaqeen. Yaqeen of what? Yaqeen of al-akhirah. Yaqeen biwujudillah. Yaqeen in the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yaqeen that this life was not created to just eat and drink and collect things in this dunya. That there is a purpose that preceded this existence, and that's between فَلِلَّهِ الْآخِرَةُ وَالْأُولَى. Now it takes us, of course, after getting to yaqeen and being basically the one to now take on and carry the mission. What is the mission? فَلَمَّا جَنَّ عَلَيْهِ اللَّيْلُ رَأَى كَوْكَبًا قَالَ هَذَا رَبِّي فَلَمَّا أَفَلَ قَالَ لَا أُحِبُّ الْآفِلِينَ. What happened? When the night folded. What folded? Why did you say folded? Because the word Jannah. When you say the word Jannah, anything that has the word Jim and Noon together in this way, that actually means it's folding something, it's covering something. So al-Janeen, basically the embryo, is basically folded in his mother's belly. Okay. And when you're talking about il-Jinn, there are things that you cannot say. You're talking about Jannah al-Layl, that the darkness of the night basically covered everything. That's basically il-Jannah, is basically something with the amount of greenery basically covering everywhere. That's basically what is making al-Jannah Jannah, because of the amount of greenery, the amount of plants that are covering basically everywhere in this garden. Okay, so that's basically right there. So al-Layl unfolds. When you look at Jannah alayhi al-Layl, so what does that look like? Does that mean that, because when you look at the moon, it is obvious that the moon wasn't there at the time. So it was basically dark night. And then there was a star, a shining star, well, that was a planet, which star, which planet. Al-Kawkab is not necessarily a planet per se. Kawkab can sometimes be as a Najm as well. Okay, but Al-Kawkab is a planet, is basically the star would basically get light. Okay, but the planet would reflect light. So was it something that was reflecting light? Was it actually reflecting light? It was something shining in the sky. And then he said, هَذَا رَبِّي. This is my Lord. Did he actually say that this was his Lord? Did he, how does that even look like? Or did he say that to assume that this would be Lord? Why? Because this is what they believed in. They believed that the stars, the moons, the planets that that those are actually gods. So he said, okay, let's use this hypothesis that you're using and tell you, so this would be God. I'm not saying that this would be God. So this is that statement. I'm telling you and using it as a hypothesis. So this would be God. In other words, under your claim, based on what you are saying, not based on what I believe in. So the scholars that said that that was the story of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam basically giving dawah, they said when he said قَالَ هَذَا رَبِّي, he was saying it as a hypothesis according to them and letting them know, so this is God. The other scholars that said that no, قَالَ هَذَا رَبِّي, some scholars actually said his story, the scholars that said that that was his story, they said that was in his early childhood, that he was a young boy in search of truth, in search of basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that once he had seen the star, he was like, that's God. And of course, the other scholars, they said that's absolutely not, because the prophet is going to be infallible from shirk. We're going to get there, okay? فَلَمَّا أَفَلَ قَالَ لَا أُحِبُّ الْآفِلِينَ. What is afal? Afal basically would be to turn away. Okay, so Jannah, the night basically comes in, covers everything in darkness, and then the night, afal. Afal, it basically went away. So that's when, what afal? The darkness or the kawkab? The kawkab. The kawkab, the planet, basically just went away. In other words, could no longer see it. And he said, I don't like those that we can no longer see, because if we can no longer see their presence, that means their ability to control life, to control us and control our future and us having a relationship with them, that means it ceases to exist. That was the premise. So he was laying out a premise that if you are saying that this is God, right there, how could this be God if he is gone? Then he cannot be God, because he's basically not there in our life anymore. Because, well, wait a minute, just because you can't see it, it doesn't, they knew that just because you can't see it now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means right now we can't see it, but with the moon and the planet basically rotating, we just went away from it, but it's still there. So he knew that they weren't stupid to actually think, oh, just because I can't see it, that means it's not there. But he was trying to get them to the whole idea that if you thought that these planets had control over our life, over our rizq, over everything, then you recognize at one point they were there, you had a relationship with them. Now that thing is not capable of seeing you, cannot relate to you, then that's not something that I can worship, because then it would not have the same effect, it would not have the same power over me. So that was Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam proving to them that this cannot be a God. Yet scholars debated whether Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam had announced his faith early on as he was trying to prove this argument to them. Did they know that where he was going with all these questions, where he was going with all of these hidden debates? Were they hidden, or was it something that was open? Was this a story that once upon a time he was walking with these group of guys and, you know, these people, and he was basically laying out this statement in order to do da'wah? Or was it something that was in public? You know, right there, sun is gone, It's basically night, and then he announces it, and the idea goes out there. Or was it at one point he was basically, in a conversation with certain probably important figures that he was telling them, well, if you were to see it, a planet, and the planet is gone, what actually happens? In other words, does it really have to be that an actual thing that we live at the moment? Or can I talk about it and you understand what I'm talking about? If I were to talk about, well, what happens when it becomes dark? What happens to the planet when it's not when it's not there anymore? Does it have any impact on you? Does that mean this is more of an allegory, like a symbolic story, or what really is unfolding here? The most important thing is that the ayat were demonstrating basically the story of what happened and how Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was laying out the statement to bring about that knowledge and that certainty to the people. Okay, let's see. Ra'a kawkaba, basically saw that Ra'a kawkaba, basically had seen that planet. But here's the thing, some scholars actually said قيل رأى ذلك من شق الصخرة الموضوع لرأس السرب. This one's quite ironic because some scholars actually focused that there was a story that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam in his early childhood, his mother was hiding him in some cave because she didn't want Namrud to basically know about him. So he was hiding there, did not make him public yet until it was safe to do so. And he managed to basically look through some kind of an opening in that cave and look out and actually see, oh, there's something shining bright up there. And then that was in his early childhood and thought, oh, that's probably God. And then that was the other scholars that said that was the story, and then they related it in here, and they, that's why some actually said that was when he was 15 years old or 7 years old and all of that. But really, there's no evidence on that. Just to keep in mind, there's no evidence on that. Now let's look at the word qala hada rabbi. When he said, "This is my Lord," was this something that he was trying to investigate? Was this something during his early childhood? Was this something before that he had known about the Lord Almighty and in wahi? Or is this based on that, they said, well, that means he wouldn't be kafir per se, because he was already underage and under the age of puberty. And that's what they had depended on. They said, we've got an evidence to prove that. It was narrated on Ali ibn Abi Talha and Ibn Abbas that they said when this ayah, in regards to this ayah, that he basically had literally worshipped this planet until it was gone. And then, of course, same thing with the sun and the moon. And then at the end, he recognized that these things were not God and could not be God because they would not be there be there at those other times. So that's when he basically said, Inni bari'un mimma tushrikun. So that was what the opinion that basically said that was in his early child. The other opinion, they basically said, well, no, this is actually not true, because it is impossible that a prophet would, in any stage of his life, be a person of shirk in any stage of his life, but he was always a person of tawheed. And that's what he would know, and that he would never but worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they said, the ones that rejected, they said, how is it that he basically had reach the level وَلِيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ, and then you would basically go back and actually say, after having yaqeen, you're going to say that he was living this doubt again? How is it that he had yaqeen and then all of a sudden he goes into this doubt again, and he was living this uncertainty to who God is? And just keep this one, I'm trying to lay out the debate. Okay, especially that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned about Prophet Ibrahim, that he said, وَجُنُوبْنِي وَبَنِيَّ أَن نَعْبُدَ الْأَصْنَامِ, and keep me and my children from worshiping the idols. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even said about Prophet Ibrahim, إِذْ جَاءَ رَبَّهُ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, when he had come to his Lord with a heart that is pure. So what is that supposed to tell us? That he basically had never associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, they said, well, with the word هَذَا رَبِّي, to mean this is based on what you are claiming. You're saying that that's God. So this is God. In other words, this is more of a statement that you are claiming, not what I am adopting. Okay? Because they were worshiping the idols and the sun and the moon and all of these different things. And of course, that's very similar. أَيْنَ شُرَكَائِي? The ayah basically said, أَيْنَ شُرَكَائِي? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asking them to get shuraka? No. This is more of a rhetorical way to basically right there lay out their statement, not me adopting their statement. So when the ayah, for example, says, أَيْنَ شُرَكَائِي? It's not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking them to give them, or to give him, all the partners. He's not asking them to do that. He's basically letting them know that that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as any partners to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So same thing, when he would say, هَذَا رَبِّي, this isn't saying that he is adopting that statement. He's saying, this is the claim that you are making, and now to respond to it, now then, of course, we would see those different, those similar paradigm to say, okay, here's the moon, now it's gone, now you can't see it. Here's the sun, now it's gone, now you can't see it. What does that tell you? That the different things that you are seeing around you are not necessarily going to be what controls your life, what controls the aspects of life. In other words, these things are creatures and not creators. That's what he was trying to get to, that these things are creatures and not creators. Something determined that they would be not visible anymore. Something determined their place. Something determined their orbit. Or else, why did they disappear? Who made them disappear? That's what he was trying to get to. He was trying to get to that the orbits, that the paradigm, that the pattern, that the system was not created by them, but the system was created, including them, was actually created by something that is beyond creation. That's what he was trying to get to. That these creatures, sun, moon, planets, whatever it is, idols, those are things, whether you created or they were created, they cannot be God, because a God is supposed to be beyond creation. In other words, God cannot be a creature because he is the creator. Okay, let's see. And it was also said, when Prophet Ibrahim ﷺ got out of the cave, he basically saw this star, and then he was seeking his Lord Almighty, and he thought that that was God. But then, of course, when he had seen the light and it went away, and then knew that that wasn't God, and when he had seen the moon, looked at it, and he said, well, when it's gone, basically the light of the moon went away, then that's when he said, لَئِن لَمْ يَهْدِنِي رَبِّي لَأَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْقَوْمِ الضَّالِّينَ. And that's when he said, if the Lord Almighty would not give me guidance, I would be amongst those that are in illusion. فَلَمَّا رَأَى الشَّمْسَ بَازِغَةً قَالَ هَذَا. When he had seen the sun basically coming and shining strong and wide. He said, this is my Lord. And they said, this is not shirk, but this is actually to say that this would be the light of the Lord Almighty giving it that brightness. Okay, so here's the thing. For the scholars that said that this was the journey of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, they also use this, the journey of his basically finding truth and certainty. They said, here it is. He said, لَإِن لَمْ يَهْدِنِي رَبِّي لَأَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْقَوْمِ الضَّالِّينَ. If the Lord Almighty does not give me guidance, I would be amongst those that are in delusion, okay, or in an illusion. Okay, here's the thing. The scholars that said that was his story, they said, well, he was at that moment saying, I would be amongst the Dhalin if the Lord Almighty does not guide me. The other scholars that said, no, that's not his story of guidance. That's a hypothesis he's laying out to those that are arguing with him. He was keeping his faith, but he was trying to lay it on himself, but he was trying to let them adopt the idea and the position. What does that look like? You know, I would say, yeah, just like when you would, for example, say, you know, if I were you, this is how I would relate to this, even though I'm actually not there. I'm not you, and that would never even happen. I'm never going to be you. But I would say, if I were you, this is what I would do. And it's never going to happen that I'm going to be you. But I would lay it that way in order to motivate you to adopt this stance or the idea that I am trying to propose. So here, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, according to those scholars, they said, when he was saying, لَإِن لَمْ يَهْدِنِي رَبِّي, he was trying to basically let them know that if we are recognizing that these celestial beings fail to be God, then if we don't get the guidance from that God, then we would be in a delusion, in an illusion, basically, and we would be astray. What did he want to say? He wanted them to know that he's also using it on himself, that if I am not guided by my Lord, he said, لَإِن لَمْ يَهْدِنِي رَبِّي, by my Lord. What is he letting them know here? That he too, using that hypothesis, all that argument, that he's telling them, well, if I'm not guided by my Lord, and if you're not guided by Allah or by the Lord, then we're all going to be astray. Whoever is not guided by the Lord, then they're going to be astray, whether it's myself or whether it's you. In other words, was laying out the statement in a way to tell them that I'm not speaking to you from a hierarchy position, but here I'm helping you and letting you know that I too would fall under this argument. And if I do not get the guidance from the Lord, then I would be amongst those that had gone astray. And the same falls on you. If you are not guided by your Lord, then you're astray. And if I'm not guided by my Lord, then I'm astray. So, you know, I want you to look at this. You know, it's quite interesting how both opinions can, I guess, interpret it. The second group, they said, well, no, it's basically his story, and that's why he was saying, if I'm not guided by my Lord, I will be astray. In other words, he was confused at the time. It's quite ironic that to say that, you know, he was saying, Lam yahdini Rabbi. I absolutely disagree with the idea that that was his personal path to finding certainty. because you would not know God and say, لَإِن لَمْ يَهْدِنِي رَبِّي. You're announcing it right there already. You're announcing that guidance comes from God. It would be a form of a contradictory statement if you were to believe in God and at the same time deny it. You're just like someone would translate La ilaha illallah as there's no God but God. That's an oxymoron. What do you mean there's no God but God? There's no God worthy of worship but Allah. And of course, لَإِن لَمْ يَهْدِنِي رَبِّي, in other words, he recognized the existence of God Almighty. Okay? And recognized, and he was seeking guidance, or was he laying that out as a statement? Okay, let's continue. فَلَمَّا رَأَى الشَّمْسَ بَازِغَةً قَالَ هَذَا رَبِّي. When he had seen the sun basically wide and bright, shining bright. What's the difference between القمر بازغ and الشمس بازغ? What is بازغ anyways? بازغ is basically when something from amongst so many different things just shines in a way that is so obvious. You know, it's kind of like sticking out. Okay, that's البزوغ. Sticking out, and kind of like when you have something and something just in the middle, you could see it, boom, right there, sticking out, and definitely you cannot hide it. You cannot deny it. It's sticking out. It's so apparent. It's so obvious. It's so bright. You just can't deny it. It's just right there, shining bright in your eyes. Okay. هذا ربي فلما أفلت. Notice فلما أفلت, when the word أفل basically means to go away. Okay. فلما أفلت. So why did it use the sun as أفلت and the moon as أفلة? One is masculine, the other one's feminine. So the sun is masculine or feminine? Wait a minute. So anyways, he used the هذا الشمس or هذا ربي. He basically said, this is my Lord. So that the هذا is referring to Rabbi. Okay. But he still used هذا أكبر to mean what? To mean a Rabb is bigger, or to mean الشمس. هذه الشمس or هذا الشمس. هذه الشمس. Okay. هذه الشمس وهذا القمر. القمر is masculine. الشمس is feminine. So when he was saying هذا أكبر, this is referring to الرب. Like, oh, this Lord is bigger, masculine. فلما أفلت, هذه الشمس أفلت. Okay. قال يا قوم إني بريء مما تشركون. Okay, now goes the second statement. Let's delete a couple things here. Okay. So what happened? Let's take that moment and actually see. So in the beginning of the statement, he said, لا أحب الآفلين. He was basically announcing it as, I'm not liking this type of relationship that you would have with these gods. And then he was taking it at a second level and saying, if I were not guided from our Lord, then we would be amongst the dhalin. So here's the second step. In the third step, he basically said, قال يا قوم إني بريء مما تشركون. I laid out the different argument. In the first one, told you I'm not liking this, I'm not amongst it, I'm not joining you in this. In the second one, I'm telling you, you know what? I'm separating myself. In the third statement, no, I'm taking it as an announcement. إني بريء مما تشركون. I'm completely innocent, and I'm completely separating myself away from all the different partners that you're associating with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I want you to look at this one, because if you're saying in the beginning that was the story of that mission, then that would lay out that in the beginning he was letting them know that he's at odds with their belief system. لا أحب الآفلين. Then in the second one, once he was capable of laying out a certain argument, that's when he was, actually the place of truth is supposed to be coming from God. That's the place of truth. It's supposed to be coming from God and not from your claims. Because your claims, I already had told you that I'm at odds with. So now I'm telling you the only truth that I'm going to be accepting is the truth that it's coming from God himself. Then finally, now that I recognize that truth comes from God, then I'll tell you that I am innocent. I'm at a complete opposition of what you're believing in terms of shirk. Complete opposition. So what does that opposition look like? Fair enough. إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين. What does that opposition look like? Simple. I had turned my face to the Lord, to the one that created the heavens and the earth, as worshiping him alone, and I'm not associating partners with him. وحاجه قوم. Once he announced that opposition and stood strong and clear that this is not what I'll be adopting, حاجه قوم. That's when they were willing to debate, but of course they debated with him because they recognize, when do you debate somebody? When you recognize that they have an argument that is probably something that we could give and take and probably debate here. So they basically started debating him. And then he said, Atuhajuni. I want you to look at this one because Atuhajuni, this is actually called mad lazim kalimi muthaqqal. This takes 6 counts. This takes 6 counts. You know the proper way of reading this in tajweed. That's how you're going to be reading that one. What is that supposed to mean? In Lugha Arabiya, the sound of the word, the way you articulate it basically reflects the senses and the feelings and the meanings. The senses basically reflects the meaning that it contains. So when if we were to say, for example, the is the tip of your tongue, the letter the, all the way into your throat. What does that mean? The food started out at the tip of your tongue and boom, goes right into your esophagus and basically goes in there. ذاق. Ra, 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 ra. What do you got? The ra, basically turning in a certain direction, basically with your tongue. What are you saying? You're opening your eyes with the opening your eyes. Lugha Arabiya is fascinating. Lugha Arabiya is fascinating. Okay. So when you look at Atuhajuni in that way, what is it supposed to say? That the debate was strong, the debate was long, the debate was tough, the debate contained a lot of fierce. Atuhajuni fillahi wa qad hadan. The debate was strong and fierce. ولا أخاف ما تشركون به إلا أن يشاء ربي شيئا. Why speak about fear? Because remember, the debate was so fierce that they were using different methods, not only to bring about a debate and trying to basically refute what he was saying, but they were going to the second level, which is what? If we can't convince you, then we're going to force it upon you. Forcing it upon you actually means we're going to use physical force. We might even go farther and actually execute you. So that's when Prophet Ibrahim عليه السلام said, وَلَا أَخَافُ مَا تُشْرِكُونَ. I'm not afraid of the things that you're worshiping, and I'm not afraid of you either. That doesn't scare me. You can use all the different threats and you can use all the different types of persecution. I'm going to stay firm and strong in announcing that إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ رَبِّي شَيْئًا. Unless the Lord Almighty wills that you would harm me in some way, Possibly, but وَسِعَ رَبِّي كُلَّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا. The Lord Almighty basically surrounds, and knowledge encompasses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge encompasses and basically surrounds and basically goes beyond all other knowledge. Why the word knowledge? Because he was proposing an idea. He was proposing a fact. He was proposing a statement. And they basically considered that, oh, well, no, we're not going to take that as a fact. Debated that. أَفَلَا تَتَذَكَّرُونَ. He was basically telling them, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the source of ilm, is the source of certainty. And that's where, of course, we could see, that's where, of course, we could see when it says, إِنَّمَا قَالَ هَذَا رَبِّي, when he was telling them, this is my Lord, etc. That was basically just to let them, yeah, I believe that there's God. But your proposal that it's the moon god, or it's the star god, or it's the planet god, or it's the sun god, that's basically not something that I will basically take whatsoever. And it was narrated in authentic hadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had described Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, Nurun ala, sorry, not Ibrahim alayhi salam, but described the heart of a believer, that it is Nurun ala Nur. Remember, مثل نوره كمشكاة فيها مصباح, right? That's basically Nurun ala Nur, basically describing the heart of the believer, that it is basically light upon light, that the believer would know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and would then let his heart guide him to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And once they know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would add on to that light further light. And that's the same thing as Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. He knew Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through his heart and was capable of knowing that through the different evidence, mental evidence that is, and he knew that he had a Lord and a creator, and that's how he had known already Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in himself. And then once, of course, his knowledge was strong, he announced it, أَتُحَاجُّونِي فِي اللَّهِ وَقَدْ هَدَانِ. Are you debating me in regards to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when he had guided me in all of this? At the end, I'm not going to fall for your statement and for your delusion and for your shirk and certainly for your dalal. I'm going to stay strong and basically stick to the Lord Almighty's guidance. And certainly this is right there, just to explain this one. You know, I know we're running out of time. Okay. Of course, we talked about this one. I'm trying to, right there, I'm trying to go over some of the statements. You know, this one's quite interesting right there. فَلَمَّا أَفَلَتْ قِيلَ إِنَّ تَأْنِيثَ الشَّمْسِ لِتَفْخِيمِهَا وَعِظَمِهَا فهو كقولهم رجل نساب وعلامة. What does that mean? Okay, you know, this one's quite interesting. It was said, he said that giving the sun a feminine pronoun, that's basically giving us an indication that it was magnificent. Why am I commenting on this one? Because many would assume that al-Lugha al-Arabiyya is misogynist in itself, which is actually very odd. Al-Lugha al-Arabiyya is not misogynist. In fact, believe it or not, in some ways in Lugha Arabiyya, to give a feminine pronoun is actually to show magnificence, just like we would say rajulun nasaba. What is nasaba or rajulun allama? Nasaba meaning that he has complete knowledge of people's ancestry and progeny and all of that. And rajulun allama, that he is such a knowledgeable person that he is not only a alim, but he's a allama, he's beyond all. Okay, that he's beyond all. Okay, so إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض. That was, I know, a little off topic. إني وجهت وجهي للذي. What is وجهت وجهي? Why the face? Because why not وجهت رأسي, وجهت يدي, وجهت كتفي? Because الوجه contains your eyes, in the most important senses, your of course, everything that really makes your identity. So when he said وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا مشركين, in other words, everything about my identity is basically directed at the one that created السماوات والأرض حنيفا. Why did he not just say وجهت وجهي للذي, maybe things like لإله السماوات والأرض? Why فطر, not إله السماوات والأرض or رب السماوات والأرض? Because he wanted them to know that these things, القمر, الشمس, etc., are basically creatures. So when he said فطر السماوات والأرض, meaning the one that created everything in the heavens and the earth. What is فطر? How is فطر different than خلق? خلق is to create something from nothing. فطر is to instill one, yes, to create something, but it's also to instill a certain system. Okay? And that's why we would say fitra. What is the fitra? It's basically the intrinsic thing in you. It's basically something that you were created in. You're created with. Sorry, not in, but with. Okay? That's al-fitra. Something deep on the inside. It's the system that is within you, whether you recognize it or not. It's a certain system on the inside of you. So when we look at فطر السماوات والأرض, this isn't just talking about something being created, the one that created the heaven and the earth. No, he was going farther. He was like, no, you already know that it was created, but I want you to recognize the system as well is also created by Allah Almighty. The system. Not only are the things, but even the system is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's basically to lay out that argument and the conclusion and the theme right there. And وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ, to let them know that he is making a final statement to basically announce that as right now a believer, that he is not going to use their delusion and their culture as the area that puts him in the delusion that that is certainty, but he basically is believing in the Lord Almighty through al-wahi. But is that through al-wahi alone, or is that also the mental side? In other words, we're speaking about the different arguments, mental side, the way he was capable of seeing and understanding that through mental vision even before getting al-wahi, or is it al-wahi, or is it ru'ya sadiqa as well? Now we see that Nuri Ibrahim alayhi salam had the light of intelligence, the light in the heart, and the light in his soul, and certainly all of that had given him basically the level of being the most, and in fact one of the most important prophets ever to come. This is it, inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. If there are any questions or comments, I would love to hear them. I know we kind of went on a lot of topics, but inshallah, that's okay. How about this? Who feels that this is Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam's journey? And who feels that this is his journey in making basically da'wah? In other words, da'wah journey, and not his personal journey. And I'd like to hear why. So do you agree with group A that that's his personal journey in finding Iman? Or do you agree with B that these ayat are basically describing the journey that he was doing da'wah to his own people. No one wants to say anything? Okay, I'll get you, inshallah. Allah yahfadak ya Rabbi. I'll basically end the